Do we have any guests here today? Are there any high school students who've come? Okay, if you wouldn't mind, Robin would like to get your email address if you're willing to give it to her. You want to raise your hand again? If you want to give it to her. There's someone down here as well. Any other visitors who might not be on our mailing list who would like to do that? You'll see Robin. She'll take your email. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes. We can have a chat. Welcome back. Lost and found. Any other visitors? Not wanting to identify yourself. We are very excited to have Fritz and Bernie back with us. Does anybody have any announcements before I start? Okay, I want to remind you all that next week we will have the Robert Harris Memorial Lecture, and our lecturer will be Michael Fairbaum. But today we have Fritz Tubach and Bernie Rosner, who've written the book, as you know, Uncommon Friendship. That book was also created through the blood, sweat, and tears of Sally Tubach, who is the person who did a great deal of the editorial work on it, and the person who reined the two of them in. And I think she is with a whip. And I think she's the best person to give you a little information before we hear Fritz and Bernie talk. And then once Sally talks, the two of them can decide who goes first. And they'll each make a statement, and hopefully you'll have lots of questions for this most uncommon friendship. So, Sally?
Thank you, Myrna, and thank you for the invitation. We're delighted to be back here for the second or third time. As Myrna mentioned, I was a stylistic editor on this book, and I'm a freelance writer. I'm neither Jewish nor German. This is something that can happen in the post-Holocaust world. But I studied German at UC Berkeley. I got my Ph.D. in German and have been interested in German history and in its glories and its disasters. In working together with Bernie and Fritz on this book, it was very important to me to be a part of bringing back to life Bernie's lost family. This was a very moving experience for me because Bernie is a person who lost his entire family, and also every document that might have proved his existence, every letter. He has no photographs left of his family. He's a man without any memorabilia. And that goes, of course, for his family who was lost. So their existence now is contained, part of it, in the text of this book. So that was a very moving experience for me to be a part of it. Bernie was born in Budapest in 1930, and he was raised in a small village in rural Hungary. And as I mentioned, he's the sole survivor of his family. I might ask him to stand up for a moment in case there's any confusion who's who here. This is Bernie Rosner. And my husband, Fritz Tubach, was born in 1930 in San Francisco. However, at the age of 3, his father, who was German, decided to take his family back to Germany. So Fritz grew up from the age of 3 in Germany. His father found employment with the Nazi Party and was in the counterintelligence service for the Nazis. After the war, Fritz was able to return to the United States. Having been born in San Francisco, he reclaimed his American citizenship and came back to the U.S. And the story, they'll pick up on the story from then, but I might just mention the book has been translated into Dutch and German. We had and as we mentioned, Italian as well. And we have a film producer in Southern California interested in making a film. We don't know if it will happen, but intriguing possibility. So that's it. I'll ask Bernie to start with his statements.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ms. Goodman, for inviting us again to talk at this prestigious event. And thank you all for taking the time to listen to me and hopefully give us a chance to answer your questions if time permits. By far the greatest reward that has come our way as a result of the book, thank you, has been the outpouring of goodwill and warmth from friends and strangers alike. Whenever I talk to young people, I consider it a special occasion for me, and also I believe it is a special occasion for my audience. And that's true for at least 3 reasons. First, I was just a little over 12 when I ended up on the platform of Auschwitz and started the nightmare of the concentration camp. In other words, several years younger than you were. Now, of course, I hope that in none of your lives will you ever experience anything even remotely as horrendous as living through a Holocaust. But having been young and knowing that everybody faces their crises and upheavals and uncertainties at that time, I hope that my story and what happened to me will give you all some inspiration when the time has come before, I'm sure, and will come when you will need to kind of gather up your resources and take stock of what's happening to you and what will you do about it. The second reason is this. I just had my 76th birthday, and I realized that getting near the end of the road, and it is a fact that as the years go on, survivors of the Holocaust are going to be fewer and fewer, and before long there won't be any left. You, or those coming right after you, will probably be the last generation of students who will hear the story out of the mouth of somebody who actually lived through it. And I think you will agree with me that hearing the story from somebody who has experienced it is more meaningful and memorable than just reading it out of a textbook. And when you are old, when you're older and have children of your own, and these occasions arise, you can tell them that you have actually heard the story from somebody who actually lived through it. And finally, while it is somewhat of a cliche, you are the future. And it is up to you to make sure that things like those times, and unfortunately the things that are happening today, just do not keep repeating themselves over and over again. So as I say, I think this is a very special occasion. While the early part of my life was dominated by turmoil, upheaval, and horror, most of the latter part of it was spent under slightly more benign conditions, practicing law in California. The fact that I chose the law as a career is due to a number of reasons, but there's little question in my mind that after witnessing the breakdown of the basic norms of civilized behavior and the repudiation of decency, tolerance, and human dignity, I was strongly drawn to a profession which ideally, at least, holds up as its goals the very values that were so brutally trampled upon by the perpetrators of the Nazi atrocities. During recent years, on September 11, 2001 in this country, and continuing on in other parts of the world to the very present, humanity has once again come face to face with evil. I believe that the subject and theme of our story are particularly appropriate and opportune for this time of uncertainty and of evil. One point of relevance in my mind is that these recent events, just as the centerpiece event of my story, demonstrate that hate and fanaticism can and have done more harm to humanity than the more conventional criminal motives of greed or self-gratification. It is a sad but true fact that the fanatics who are committing the crimes today and the psychopaths who conceived and implemented the horrors of the Holocaust were somehow able to convince themselves that they were pursuing some just or righteous cause. To the extent that our story contributes even to a minute degree to the concept that humanity, decency, and friendship can redeem and heal, I feel that we have accomplished everything and more that we could have possibly have hoped for. My many friends, my 3 children, and my own conscience have long urged that I tell my story. That I have not done so until relatively recently is due to a number of reasons, including a rather busy career, and frankly having been endowed by nature with more than my fair share of a tendency to procrastinate. That I finally got around doing so is also due to a number of reasons. First, having passed now my 75th and 76th birthday, I'm mindful that the end is closer than the beginning, that time is running out. Second, when one is young, it was certainly true in my case, one tends to concentrate on the present. For most of my life, adult life, I prided myself that I traveled with a minimum of baggage. I now realize that this was one of the mechanisms I subconsciously adopted to cope with the past. But as the years advance, the realization becomes clear that the past is an integral part of one's life and personality, and that the human experience cannot be fully appreciated and felt and experienced without fitting the past into the mosaic of the whole. And finally, while I'm not particularly conscious of failing memory, it seems logical to assume, and certainly part of the human biological process, that recollection fades with age, and it's better to recall and be able to recall things today than some years down the line. The upshot of all these reflections was a decision to finally tell my story. When I was ready to do so, a series of coincidences, which in their own way are as unique and fascinating as any other aspect of my life, brought it about that I met and made friends with a man by the name of Tubach, whose background and history could not have been more different than mine. While I was a Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, Fritz was raised in wartime Germany. His father was a Nazi, and Fritz himself in his early youth was a member of the Jungvolk and the Hitler Youth, which were basically the Boy Scout movement in our country. By the time we met in the early 1980s, about 40 years following the end of the war, we had both become Americans. We both accepted the principle that you're responsible for your own actions and not for those of your father or other members of your nation or race. Over the years, we formed a friendship. We discovered we both had fascinating stories to tell, and we decided to tell our stories together. The result was the book, An Uncommon Friendship, which has enjoyed a fair degree of success and which is the main reason why we are here today. The rest of what I have to tell you is basically something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born, I've said before, 76 years ago, in a smallish town by the name of Tubach in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had a basically normal and happy childhood. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of a Jewish Orthodox upbringing and a sensitive and literate mother. Both of these influences imbued me with an abiding love and respect for books and learning. Anti-Semitism was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our village going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land, and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, and other professions. It was also personal in terms of Jews being bullied and held up to contempt and hostility, not by any means by all of the non-Jewish population, but by a substantial segment of the community, many of whom were members or followers of the Hungarian version of the Nazi and other far right-wing parties. But this was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of racism and extermination as preached and practiced by Hitler and his thugs, and the anti-Semitic undercurrents running through the Hungarian political and cultural life did not significantly affect our everyday life and my basically happy and tranquil childhood. All this changed with a dramatic suddenness on a very specific date, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from a study session in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah when a neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. Within the time available here, I will not go into the detail why this happened at that time, pretty late in the war, and if time permits, and if anybody's interested, I'll be happy to explain that during our question and answer session. The effects of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jews of the community. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear prominent yellow stars on their outer clothing. One of the memories I have of the night before this went into effect, my mother sitting in our living room and sewing the yellow stars on our outer clothing. By mid-May, all Jews were herded into a ghetto. My family was lucky in this respect because our home was within the area designated as part of the ghetto. But our 3-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, also became home for numerous relatives, as I recall, between 16 to 18 in all, whose homes were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tubach came during the latter part of June 1944. On 24 hours' notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure in front of our homes with no more than 1 suitcase per person. 3 images stand out for me from the day on which we will march down the main street of Tubach to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A few of them were out on the street jeering with comments such as, "You Jews are finally getting what's coming to you." The great majority of the townfolk simply retreated into their homes, closed their shutters, and shut out the sight of their fellow citizens, being driven down the street like cattle. The second memory was the school, public school, on the way to the station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. Now you must remember, as I indicated, that up to there I led basically a normal life, not the kind of life you lead, but a normal life. And many things worse than that happened later, but You can imagine a 13-year-old kid suddenly being steeped into this kind of nightmare, literally from one day to the next. The third memory is at the brickyard, where we had basically just bare earth for accommodations, where an elderly woman, and this was a Friday evening, the onset of Shabbat, was standing up to recite her Sabbath prayers and was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7,000 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos in that part of Hungary. From there, during the first week of July 1944, we were loaded onto cattle cars, between 50 to 60 men, women, and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. I remember it was a Friday, and Fritz and I got a calendar for 1944 to determine what the date, pretty precise. By the time the sliding door of the freight car, which remained locked throughout the entire 5-day journey, was open, there were at least a half dozen corpses in the car, and many more whose minds became unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, there was chaos, brutality, and confusion. But my immediate family, my father, my mother, my kid brother, and I were still together. The first thing that happened was an announcement on the loudspeaker that all those in charge of each cattle car were to report somewhere. My father was designated as in charge of our car, though what he could do is I never came to me or became aware of. Anyway, when the announcement was made, he left us and I never saw him again. Next, the announcement was made on the loudspeaker that men and women should separate because showers would be given. By this time, my mother was very frightened and insisted that we two boys stay with her. Being a 13-year-old, I told her that I wasn't about to take a shower with a bunch of women. She didn't argue with me, but her last word to me was, whatever you do, stick with your little brother. She left us and I never saw her again. The next thing that happened is that all of us males who were on the platform were lined up, and at the head of the line were two Nazi SS officers. As each person came up to the head of the line, they were looked over and sent either to the left or the right. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but those who were fit to work, or seemed to be fit to work, were sent to the right. Those who were sick, old, and otherwise young, or otherwise unable to work were sent to the left. My younger brother, who was just a little over 10, was ahead of me in the line, and the Nazis looked at him and without hesitation sent him to the left. Heeding back to my mother's admonition, I started following him. I was about 2 or 3 steps past where the Nazi was when he reached out and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, pulled me back, and shoved me over to the right. To this day, I do not know why he did this. Was he angry at me because I made my own decision without being told what to do? Or did he look at me and say, well, marginally, this one may be able, we can get some work out of him. He knew that there would be further hurdles, further screenings down the line, and if others in authority decided I was not able to work or fit to work, that I would be taken care of then. In any event, that shove from the left to the right made the difference between my surviving and being here and the rest of my family being sent to the gas chambers that very day. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day, for the next 10 months until my liberation by the Americans during the week of May 1945, was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first, in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid them to the gas chambers. This was because even though I survived that initial screening, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for work assignments, permanent work assignments. By mid-September of 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consisted of the old, the sick, and those like me, too young to be selected for work. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. It is somewhat ironic that in the annals of the Holocaust, Mauthausen is considered one of the deadliest and most brutal and vicious of all the concentration camps. It's ironic because to me, it literally being sent to Mauthausen saved my life. If I had to go through one more selection and I flunked, which I probably would have, that would have been the end of me. After being at Auschwitz, and at various times in the history of that camp, there were gas chambers and people were put to death for the reasons that were put to death in Auschwitz. But by the time I was there, you were put to death only if you got sick and could not work, or otherwise were punished for some reason. By the time I was there, the main battle for survival was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive, hunger, cold, brutal beatings, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and almost every other privation known to man. I suspect that most people in this room have seen pictures of the cadaver-looking creatures that emerged from the concentration camps upon liberation by the Allies. I was one of them. Interestingly, I know that is the right one. The first time I got really badly sick was right after there for a number of reasons, including contracting typhus from lice and other unsanitary conditions. Gobbling up a whole can of greasy cold meat after having had maybe half of that during the whole year, having found and broken into a German storehouse. In any event, I lost consciousness and I ended up in American Field Hospital, and I don't know for how long I was out. But by the time I woke up and I weighed 26 kilos at the age of 14, which is about 52 pounds. But I was resilient, and probably my short stature is partly due to the fact that I was lucky and I just quit growing, and because kids who were even a year or two older than I was contracted tuberculosis and other diseases, and they never made it. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am, how a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave a new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy, in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. There were thousands of kids like me hustling for an extra piece of bread, or if we were really lucky, some candy or a piece of chewing gum. The only source of those goodies were the American soldiers who were stationed near our camp. So naturally, I spent much of my time hanging out near where the American soldiers were billeted. I was standing there one day in July of 1945 looking for a hustling opportunity when a Jeep drew up with 4 GIs and their duffel bags. I immediately ran up to the Jeep and offered my services as a porter. One of the GIs smiled and pointed to the duffel bag, to his bag, which I then picked up. He followed me, and my employer later told me that the bag was almost as big as I was, and all he could see was the bag and my bare heels underneath, clicking away with great energy. I deposited the bag in his room, and we tried to communicate, and we realized that our only way of doing so was broken German. In a few words, I told him my situation, and he was very visibly and deeply moved. From that day on, for the next 5 days, after he finished his work, which was interrogating and screening war prisoners. He would come by the camp and pick me up and would take me to a restaurant and to see a movie, things that I've never had before. After 5 days, the soldier was moved to another station, and I too was moved to a more decent, an orphanage, which was much more human and livable than this refugee camp. But frankly, because of a strange dream I had at first I thought this was just a wonderful, shining episode in my life, and didn't know what was going to happen, but I had one of those dreams that you don't remember the detail, but they strike you, and I had the GI's address, and I wrote him a note, and he told me then, and I still have the letter, that after he was stationed and was moved to another station, he came back and tried to find me and couldn't. Anyway, our correspondence resumed. Shortly after that, in August of 1945, the war was over, and he was sent back home. And after talking over with his family, his young wife, he wrote me a letter in November of 1945 asking me to come to this country and be a part of his family. This is remarkable enough, but even more remarkable is the fact that the name of this GI was Charles Merrill Jr., the son of the founder of the Merrill Lynch financial empire. You might say that the rest is history, but I do want to stress that while I wouldn't be here, and I have incredibly grateful to him, he's still alive today. He's now in his late 80s, but we have, in effect, retained our friendship and affection for each other. But I was determined to be as self-sufficient as I could, and by the time I went to law school, I was more or less earning my own way to there. One of the things that helped me, and I think this will also give you a graphic picture of what inflation has done. I served a stint in the service between college and law school, and I was on what's called the GI Bill, which gave you money for education. And the $110 I got from Uncle Sam a month was enough to pay the tuition at Harvard Law School in those days. I think the graphic way of seeing what inflation has done, particularly when students have to pay their tuition bills and other bills. When Fritz and I first embarked on our joint project, my intention was not to send a moral message. My intention was simply to tell my story because I realized I had some obligations to discharge. First and foremost was an obligation to my children. As they grew up, and I insisted, I wanted them to be just ordinary kids. They grew up in Orinda and went to the same school. I wanted them to be like that. I didn't shut up completely. Didn't shut out the past completely, but when they asked me questions, I would answer. They heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a systematic way. More importantly, I kept the emotion and pain out of whatever I told them, and I realize now that this was more to protect myself than to protect them. I also owed an obligation to the family I lost. My mother, my father, my kid brother, and my extended family. The story of the Holocaust, of how the millions were murdered, has been told many times, but their own story has never been told. I felt that they deserved that that be done, and that it was up to me to do it. I also felt that my story was a good and fascinating yarn that was worth telling. With all the horrors and suffering, there were moments of tension, suspense, and adventure. The old truism that often the truth is stranger than fiction is, I believe, applicable to several aspects of both our stories. But even though the story was not told to send a moral message, I believe that it does so nevertheless. And it does so on several levels. The one that I believe is particularly relevant today is the ability of two individuals who come from such starkly different beginnings to be able to surmount the walls that could have divided them. To look beyond the conventional mindset that could have made them, if not hate, at least distrust each other and enable them to form a friendship. Instead of being adversaries or strangers, they decided to ignore labels and join forces to tell what I believe is a warm and inspiring story. Thank you very much.
Just by sheer logic, obviously I'm from the other side of the Holocaust. As already was mentioned, I was born in San Francisco. You can tell from my accent, of course. And, but as already was mentioned, my father went back to Germany in 1933. And recently, or a few years ago, I saw a letter an uncle wrote about our arrival back in Germany in 1933 in autumn. And he said in that letter, well, little Fritz, that's me, did not understand a single word of German, so I taught him his first German word, namely how to say Heil Hitler. So this is sort of my linguistic introduction to Germany. Fortunes of my own life, my mother died rather suddenly in Germany in 1934. I was raised by a step-family. My father married a blacksmith's daughter, and then went off to build the Third Reich. And in this family, they was deeply split, like many German families were. If you look, of course, at Hitler's, all the movies, you think that everybody just shouted their over exactly the same way. They were not. My family was not unique in this way at all. My old family, my father's family, my mother, my grandfather was for the Kaiser Wilhelm still. He wished the Kaiser had come back. One of my uncles was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. A third uncle was a Nazi. Then my father was a Nazi. And my grandmother, she cooked for everybody and cried a lot. And this was quite a unique family, the internal struggles. And you always say, you can say things behind the wall, but never out in public. Now, when I moved to my step-family, the blacksmith of the village, they were convinced anti-Nazis. Not after the war, at that time. My stepmother was against it, very strongly, and said so openly, and so did my step-grandfather. When I was supposed to go to a camp, I was picked to be moving up in the ladder of the Hitler Youth. She didn't let me go. So we were called before the Nazi youth authorities, and they said, you have to let him go. And she said, I will not. And so the Nazis said, so hear him, if you don't let him go, you will ruin his career. And she said, you worry about your career, I worry about his. Brave woman. There are lots of jokes like that, which of course many of them didn't thought. I couldn't, but she was open enough to express it. So I was grown up in a kind of family background, not unique in Germany, that was split and saw many sides of the story, particularly since I was born in San Francisco. It always gave me a little different sense. I'm not like everybody else. You know, everybody says I was born in Hanau, in Aschaffenburg, I was born in San Francisco. They always looked. Of course, many of the teachers then cross it out. Oh, never mind. Forget it. So I grew up in that situation, but my education started really in 1945 in May. After the Americans had come to the village, conquered the village, they put a poster against the wall of a Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, with a deep ravine and the corpses at the bottom, and on the wall, some of the corpses were hanging at the wall, and the German soldiers walked on top. And that to me looked like a picture out of Dante's Hell. And I still remember, I said, this is what we have done. Or this was done in our navy. Deeply shocked me to see this. At that point, it didn't, of course, react very much, but in turns, as my life developed, I came to America, and I'll cut that part very short, because I was scared of getting a real job in America, I decided to become a professor at Berkeley instead. And There's more than 2 lines to it, but that's not germane to the story. And so in Berkeley, of course, I taught Introduction to German Culture in a very critical way. I mean, I just represented, as the more I learned, the more critical I got about what happened in Germany. In fact, my first international conference in 1916 in Copenhagen, I couldn't even want to go back to Germany. But I dealt with it, I analyzed Nazism, the Holocaust, and so on, but I never really was quite satisfied. The only thing I knew in the 60s, I got involved in became a political activist. I decided right then, I will never believe anyone where I can't see the levers of power. Okay, number one. And I also was against any forms of power that was displayed by the state. So I became a Berkeley left-wing professor. And I'm, even to this very day, Bernie is on the other side, but there's another issue here. I became an activist, and essentially it was my defining myself as an anti-fascist. I wasn't quite aware of it. And the motivation of that goes right back to 1945, standing there and seeing what had happened to these poor people at the Warsaw Ghetto. So at any rate, but I never was satisfied with my way of teaching it because it was abstract, you know, and then I met Bernie, and it's a story by itself how that worked. I think perhaps my wife should tell you how we come to meet. And I suddenly had the chance not to think about the Holocaust in abstract terms, but in terms of a one-to-one, a real survivor, and me on race on the other side. And we started to talk, and we decided to write this together, not as a book at first. It never would have worked. If we had said, we're going to write a book together, the innocence would have been lost. He said, I'd like somebody to tell my story. He didn't want us to tell it himself, write it himself, but to put a certain distance between himself and his own story. So it was told, in a sense, the third person, Bernie. And we got together, and he would tell notes, tell me this element, this element. What now comes out as a cohesive story, that's not the way I heard it initially. Fragments here and there. And the most allergic things he didn't mention that came out later. So what you now see as a smooth book like this, that's not the way the story came about. It was tough. The reason, some people ask me, well, how does it work? Wasn't there some eyeball existential kind of conflict? No, not really. Because we put a framework around it, unknowing to us. We always would have, he would tell me things, and I write them down, I draft something, then he would come over to our house, or we'd go to theirs, and we'd have a nice dinner, some drinks. And then I would sit with him, this is important, it's not superficial. And then I would read him the last section, then he would comment on it, correct, and so on. And so this is the way it went. And then Sally took the manuscript and polished it and took the German accent out of my writing. But this is not unique to Bernie in the sense that he didn't want to write his own story. If you take Elie Wiesel's story, La Vie was not written in his original native language. He didn't want it. Even he created a little distance and wrote it in French, which was his second language. Okay? So this is the way it happened. And then we wrote it. Some people say, how could you have done it? And they ask, well, how could you let him do it? Well, that's probably what made it an uncommon friendship. We did it. To me, I was the outsider, trying to understand his experiences through my way of articulating it, and then commenting on what I had written was a genuine effort on my part to communicate, really, with what happened. Ultimately, you cannot communicate the trauma itself. It doesn't work. That's probably another issue, is how to translate trauma into history, post-Holocaust experiences. Anyway, we did it, we wrote the book, and I would say what is at the bottom of what motivated me is following me. You could start with tolerance. He had to be tolerant towards me, obviously. But I also had to be tolerant towards him. I don't say, oh, forget it. Do I need to deal with this? Why don't I, go and have a walk? So tolerance, particularly on his part. But the next step from tolerance, of course, is to show some kind of sympathy, empathy for another person. And empathy is a great art to learn. If you learn empathy, that means you really begin to try to understand what the other person is like. That's the way you grow as an individual. I wish we had more of that in politics too today. I think as soon as that's a footnote. When people no longer respect each other because they don't agree with each other, that's terrible. That's the end of it. No, that's not it. You can deal with that. Read newspaper. At any rate, so we wrote this, and so I would like to just, it came out, but after synergy, empathy, tolerance, empathy came synergy. Then you can suddenly come together and work. It becomes creative. Opposites then can really, once that is broken, can really create something brand new. If you always talk to the people you agree with, nothing comes out of that. It's great over beer. Great, you're right, I'm right, you're bad, and so on. And so there we broke out of that, and it's created something new. And now I'd like to just read to you a few sections to get a sense of the book, because that's why we did it. And my wife always says, don't say it to the people, but this is our 99th reading in America. So she said, don't, No, I just say it because I think it's a fact that I just like to keep part. I don't always agree with her. So I'll read you now the first meeting we've had. Now it's quite a few years ago. I felt apprehensive about the upcoming evening with my wife's old schoolmate and her husband. It would have been easier to watch a documentary film or to participate in academic discussion on the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. This dinner for 4 could be attended by uninvited guests, any of the dead members of his family or of mine. Perhaps my distant uncle, who had been an SS officer in charge of a refugee camp near Würzburg and hanged by the surviving inmates at the end of the war, might appear. Or perhaps my own father, in his Nazi party uniform, would join us for dinner. Or my host's father and mother, as they emerged from the ashes of the crematorium. Although the subject of concentration camps didn't come up over dinner, I couldn't help thinking about it. I noticed that Bernie had light blue eyes, words from the Todesfuge, death view, of the Jewish poet Paul Celan, an Auschwitz survivor, who later committed suicide in Paris, crowded in on me. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Death is a master from Germany, his eye is blue. I repeated them several times to myself, recreating in my mind the ritual intensity with which they are repeated in the poem. As a child, I was told that I had inherited the blue eyes of my mother, who died before the war when I was 3 years old. From these self-absorbed reveries, I looked again at our dinner host and decided that perceptions were the result of the moment. Now it seemed to me that he had the upturned mouth of Frank Sinatra and could easily pass for his first cousin, if not his brother. No hint of Auschwitz there. I noted that he and I, both on the short side, were just about the same height. He was slightly wiry, and I had to watch my weight. I probably looked more Jewish in quotes than he did to those who saw people as stereotypes. My mind drifted to my father, who told me once of being terribly afraid of a barber in Germany who had asked him if he was Jewish. My father denied it, insisting that appearances can be deceptive. But he had the feeling the barber didn't believe him, would have liked to have cut his throat with a straight-edged razor. He used to shave him. The dinner conversation with the Rosners escaped me for a short while, but no one seemed to notice my silence. And my free associations about blue eyes, appearances, and barbers faded away. In reality, Bernie is a year younger than I am. As it turned out, the hours passed quickly during the mild summer evening in Southern California, where the setting sun suffuses the air with a pale yellow tinge. World War II was 2 generations behind us. The past seemed far away. We stayed late to sip cognac and watch a sampling of Bernie's video collection, Grand Opera. The Rosners had a large screen television with several remote controls. Bernie could tune in the finest arias of Mozart or Verdi. Classical music enveloped the living room. As we listened to the excerpts from Strauss, the Rosenkavalier, who at our age would not be touched by the Marschallins' musings on time as a wondrous thing. Die Zeit ist ein sonderbar Ding. Will it be best for us to just surround our pasts with a detached glow of great music? That didn't work, of course, because the heaviness of his story and also the feelings of my own guilt and whatever else could not just, you couldn't put the thin blanket of suburban living over it, let's put it this way, okay? This is how then the story proceeds and how we started to work on it. Now let me read you a passage that it's a little longer, but I think I like to read it because it really brings up a point that Sally raised, my wife, and Bernie raised. That's the story of his childhood. Again, this is the one time where we recreated his family. So when you hear it, it will come and go. But the only realities people now have, outside of Bernie's memory of them, is right here when I mention his name. Okay? So that's the kind of work on memory. Louis Rosner, Bernie's father, a redhead, had an emotional side that ill-tolerated the impertinence of his eldest son. Their frequent quarrels were caused by a lack of subordination, as Bernie describes his own behavior, assuming a fatherly tone himself. At one point, Bernie's interest in learning and books brought him into trouble. The prayer book belonged to one of the pillars of the community, sat on the shelf right next to Bernie's customary seat in the synagogue, day in and day out. Bernie coveted that marvelous leather-bound book so much that one day he stole it, took it home, tore out its pages, and deposited the cover, now devoid of its spiritual content, back in the customary place. Bernie was the prime suspect. When accused of the theft, he denied everything, prompting the owner of the book to comment sarcastically that perhaps an angel had taken it and removed its pages. The boy's insistence on his innocence gave him the nickname Angel Tralala. As the full wrath of his father was about to descend on Bernie's head, a minor religious miracle occurred. The owner of the book, the man who had dubbed him Angel Tralala, pleaded that the boy not be punished, since his transgression proved a genuine interest in reading and in matters spiritual. Thus the anger of the father was diffused, and the nickname stuck to Bernie for the remainder of his life in Tubach. Little Angel Tralala felt close to his dark-haired mother, Bernie Rosner née Schwartz, born in 1893, was a spiritual bridge to Bernie's grandfather in Kiskunhalas. She was a sensitive person who cried easily. And Bernie suspects that his mother was a hypochondriac with an imagined bad heart. She was the emotional font for him and his brother. An articulate storyteller, she was also the inspiration for his enduring love of books. He still remembers how beautiful her handwriting appeared in the letters she had read aloud to him when he was very young. Bernie's mother was also an expert seamstress and a good cook. She baked delicious sweets, cinnamon swirls, jelly rolls, the kind of cakes that showed that the village of Tubach and its inhabitants were not far from Vienna and its elegant pastries. Brother Rosner instilled in her boys a sense of duty to take the straight and narrow path. His Hungarian mother employed old-fashioned educational methods invoked all over Europe, unadorned scare tactics. When confronted with a disobedient son, she threatened him with the gypsies who roamed the landscape. If you don't behave, we'll hand you over to the gypsies who will take you away. How many times was that admonition used to reprimand European children? And in how many languages? I remember the gypsies in my village who knocked at our front door to beg. I hid behind my grandmother's skirts, fearing that they might take me away, whether I was misbehaved or not. The very gypsy wagons that moved in and out of villages struck fear into every child, since these wandering people played a sinister role in the pedagogical arsenal of European parents. In Bernie's mother's case, this disciplinary arsenal also included the Scherenschleifer, as he told me in German, the knife sharpener, who appeared periodically to sharpen the knives and scissors of the villagers. I remember this same apparition, the quintessential outsider, wearing ragged clothes and a broad-brimmed hat, descended on my village as well. The nucleus of Bernie's family, father, mother, and 2 brothers, was part of a large extended family. Bernie's mother was one of 12 siblings, and his father had 2 brothers with sizable families of their own living in Tubach. There was a paternal spinster aunt, who in contrast to his maternal spinster aunt, the strict Aunt Libby of Kunalash, was a gentlewoman, Uncle Willie Madeleine. He also had a daughter with artistic talent, who helped Bernie with an assignment in his drawing class. Unlike his brother, Alexander, Bernie couldn't draw. So this cousin sketched a steam engine for him, and Bernie received a high mark for her efforts. There he goes. All villagers, rich and poor, shared an everyday communal life that changed only with the seasons. In springtime, the various fruit crops were harvested. Cherries first, plums later, followed by apples and pears. Walnuts developed in their soft green outer shell until ripe for picking and peeling towards the end of summer. The threshold season started in August, first with the wheat, and afterwards the rye. In midwinter, our footprints marked the snow as we carried lanterns to light the way home through the dark night. And in the morning, after a night of heavy snowfall, the village was transformed into an enchanted landscape. Timeless moments of the seasons, with no beginning and no end. These memories of the boy from Tab are also the memories of the boy from Kleinheubach. But these times came to an end. They ended for Bernie in the spring of 1944, when the seasonal rhythms were replaced by the shouts of Nazis. Those harsh new voices disrupted life as the Jews of Tab had known it, and in less than 3 months ordered their deportation and extermination at Auschwitz. There, or in other camps, most of the Jews of Tab were killed. Bernie's literate mother, who thought that she had a bad heart, and a severe Aunt Libby of Kishkunalash, and Uncles Joe and Willie and their children, and Bernie's father, preoccupied with his work, and the nice spinster aunt of Tab, and Bernie's own little brother, Alexander, a talented drawer of horses, and, if he lived that long, the wise and learned grandfather of Kishkunalash, and the devout Orthodox Jew from the next pew in the synagogue, who spoke Bernie's stone, who pleaded with Bernie's father for leniency. And there is no end to this list. The only survivor among family members, friends, and acquaintances was Angel Kalala. Bernie's days time in Auschwitz. sentimental song, one of many I learned in my youth, is still sung today in German taverns when the mood is jovial. It promises that after every December, a May will surely follow. This song is usually sung towards the end of an evening of drinking, right before in München steht ein Hofbräuhaus, when people link arms and sway back and forth in a heightened sense of solidarity. That macabre bit of interior decorating in Berlin's barracks faded at nightfall, as darkness settled in on their cramped quarters. And quite another song emerged, one composed by an inmate in Yiddish. Someone would start to sing it, and the second voice would join in. Soon most of the inmates would be singing. A few remained silent on their pallets, as Bertie recalls, to listen to its desperate cry for deliverance.
This lament, this wail, is in line with Eastern Orthodox Jewish tradition, where the people who have the talent make up instant little verses and songs on the spot. It is done on both occasions of joy and sadness. And these are, of course, instant kind of folk songs that are never recorded. I heard this only once when I was lying on my pallet that day, and I don't know how many, 60 plus years ago, but it is engraved in my memory in Yiddish forever. The song goes like this: Echo viazoin farvos jokstun sazoi. Wie is Vater dein Rachmones, habet mishomain urei, von dem Himmel gib a Blick, zu den jüdischen Kinder gib Glück. Läsch eus den Feier, en soll es schon sein Genick.
In English, oh why and for what are you hunting us so? Where is, Father, your mercy? From heaven give a glance. Will Jewish children give a chance? Extinguish the fire and let it be enough. The first word of this plain echoe, how, hauntingly evokes the cry of grief that begins the Old Testament book of Lamentations. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. And the ending echoes the medieval night watchman song that exhorted Germans to extinguish lamps and fires, to prevent conflagrations from engulfing their towns. In the concentration camp, the ears of the guards keeping watch outside the barracks were closed. The plaint did not reach them. And the God the inmates invoked was deaf. Last thing I will read for you now is the last page of the book. It's not why I read it, but it's basically, we returned to Berlin, the very end, and went to an opera together there. And also I read it because Germany has changed since then a lot. Most people don't, maybe people just don't realize that. Such as the generation change, there's been a transformation. It's a very good country to be in at this point, and for the last 30, 40 years. So I'm reading it also, in a sense, to plead for this new generation of Germans, your age, even their parents. Soon after the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain crumbled, the world watched the Germans celebrate the collapse of their division. And the Jewish-American conductor Leonard Bernstein conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, not far from the ruins of the bunker. Perhaps our joy over this performance was no more than a leap of faith, an ephemeral act imaginaire, but one that we nevertheless embraced. Yet is such a leap of faith justified? For why would a past moment from Bernie's story, when the dwindling group of survivors at Kunstkirchen stacked up corpses to form partitions in their barracks, crowd in on me? Shortly before the Holocaust befell Europe, Freud described in his Civilization and its Discontents the life and death instincts as equally powerful forces. Was he right? Or can we cling instead to Thomas Mann's dictum from the Magic Mountain for guidance, as an underpinning for our act of faith, quote, "For the sake of goodness and love, man shall let death have no sovereignty over his thoughts." On our last evening in Berlin, we attended a performance of Mozart's The Magic Flute at the Staatsoper located on the main boulevard Unter den Linden in what used to be the center of East Berlin. Mozart's music floated in the air, a perfect symbol of freedom and harmony and order, and the story of the opera unfolded with both its dark night and its illuminating path, with its trials and its victories. During those few hours, we experienced, within the magic circle of music, a transformative power that is inherent in all of us. If we only have the courage, faith, and luck to let it come out to guide us. We left the opera house to say farewell to Berlin and to Germany, with Sarasso's words still reverberating in our hearts. In diesen heiligen Hallen kennt man die Rache nicht. In these sacred halls, there is no room for revenge. Thank you.
Ready for some questions?
Is there time to tell us how you met?
Sorry, my wife would tell. She knows she's responsible. That's an American story from here. Told by real life.
Okay, I went to high school in Southern California and had a friend named Susan. After high school, we went our separate ways and lost track of Susan. 20 years later, this was 1983, so you can figure out how old I am, approximately. 20 years later, I'm standing in line in the pharmacy in Walnut Creek, and it's late in the day, I'm a little tired, but I see a woman and a few people in front of me in this line, and I take a second look and I think, that sure looks like Susan from high school. And I debated with myself for a moment, should I tap her on the shoulder or look the other way and pretend I don't see her? And I think we all have these experiences when we're in a hurry or we don't want to talk to somebody, we pretend that we don't see them. Well, I stood there debating with myself, but then my curiosity got the better of my fatigue, so I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, "Are you Susan from Pally High?" And she looked at me for a moment and she said, "Sally." So she recognized me, and we left the pharmacy together, talking to each other about what had happened in the last 20 years of our life, or what had happened recently. Susan said, well, she just married a man with European background. I said, oh, that's interesting. My husband is European, too. And she said, and you know, he lost his first wife. She passed away, and I'm now the stepmother for his teenagers. I said, really? My husband lost his wife to cancer, and I'm the stepmother for his teenagers. This is amazing. And this went on, and she said, well, and my husband is about 15 years older than I am. And I said, well, that's strange. My husband's just a little bit older than I am, too. And then she said, well, Sally, where do you live? And I said, I live in Orinda. She said, Orinda? What street? It turned out that Susan and Bernie lived 4 blocks from us in our neighborhood, and we hadn't known this. So I said, okay, this is just unbelievable, too good to be true. Susan, come over for lunch in another week, and we'll catch up on the rest of it. So she came over, and Susan and I had lunch together, and that's when she told me that Bernie was a Jewish-Hungarian survivor of Auschwitz. And that's when I told Susan that, well, Fritz had grown up in Germany and been in the Jungvolk, and his father had been a Nazi. So the parameters of our friendship began there with those facts. And the Rosners first invited us to their house for dinner, and we lived so close that Fritz and I walked to their place for dinner, and we walked home. And Fritz read about that dinner. So that's how it all got started. Another amazing part of the overall story.
Was there ever any apprehension in the beginning, that first evening of meeting each other, knowing both your different lives, how they were so polar opposites? Was there any apprehension between in meeting each other?
Well, I think each of us probably has an answer to it.
Can you understand us all?
And it's a question that has been asked in various ways, including as Fritz paraphrased it earlier about the book. He said they will ask me how dare you, and they would ask me how could you.
Right.
The answer is really somewhat of an anticlimax, because the fact is that there was no particular apprehension. You must remember that this was in 1983, 40 years after the end of the war, and certainly as far as I was concerned, I was determined to put the war behind me. But more importantly, after the war, I certainly had feelings that were much more raw and bitter. But I realized, not for idealistic or altruistic reasons, that living a life of anger, bitterness is not a productive way to live. And I had to develop a philosophy which basically, the underpinnings of it simply said we take human beings are responsible for their own actions, not for what their father did or what their nationality is. And I mean, obviously, to me it makes sense, and I think it makes sense to most decent people. And when you think of it, the opposite way of looking at it is the very basis for anti-Semitism. That, Jews killed Christ, or Jews are communists, or whatever you want to put the epithets. And the other factor is that in American life, and particularly in California, I came in contact with people with German backgrounds. So by the time we met, there was not this feeling, oh my God, he's a German, and how can I possibly be friendly? And that's basically my answer, and I suspect Fritz has his own version.
Well, again, having been in Berkeley, I've met many refugees from Nazi Germany. In fact, I felt as an outsider, being just by my nature. And so actually I studied with many of Jewish immigrants in Berkeley. I grew up intellectually within essentially a Berkeley immigrant milieu, and I could go into this sort of subtext of my life. But I do, this, what you say, the apprehension or odd thing, didn't come with Berkeley. But once I went to one of the Charter Day exercise in Berkeley, and a young woman from the Czech department stood next to me. I've known her for years. She had a hood on like I, and suddenly wind blew her liver, and she had a tattoo. I couldn't believe it. And the German number 7, the Germans make a 7 with it. I couldn't believe it. My God, she was in Auschwitz. That shocked me. I'd never associated her with Auschwitz at all. So that was much earlier, but when Bernie, I knew it, and I was just I was somewhat self-conscious, let's put it this way. That's why I describe it in here too. But basically, to me, it was then also a chance to get to know him better. I do believe that now the idea of the other doesn't make sense anymore. But at that point, to me, he has this radically different background. That to me is very important to find out. Crucial. And that's probably what I brought to the table, except hunger. And that made it possible. And also the personality, it just worked. But last I want to say what I said a little while ago, when we start working, that context matters. We dinner together, draft, and you read, and you relax. He is a successful professional. That matters too, and I'm sort of too. So that also helped. We were older guys. And California mattered. That's something Bernie always points out. This is a good place to be for tolerance. Much better than you fit in whatever place you want.
This is a question from Chris. Did you at all resent your
question was whether I resent my German heritage. No, I didn't. Because the German heritage was co-opted by him. He doesn't represent it. It took me a long time to understand. Hitler claimed he is German and Germany is German. And you know, this is a very complicated issue. But I believe there is such a thing as a German heritage that transcends Hitler and is a good one. And he tried to, I can give you lots of examples of that. The city of Nuremberg, for instance, you know, the big Nazi party rallies. This city has an old tradition. It has had one of the first laws of taking care of the sick and the old. No, in a sense, I don't resent it, but I do resent the people in Nazi Germany who really took over this thing and tried to destroy that tradition. And just about did. Many Germans reject being German for a long time. But now I think there's a more healthy balance beginning. You know, and I think that's a good thing. If you resent your heritage, it's going to come back to haunt you the opposite way. Basically, I consider myself a Californian. Oh yeah, I never want to live there.
I have a question for you two.
Could you speak up?
For Bernie, I wanted to know, you went into the law, and I was curious, you know, what you did in terms of your profession with the law.
Why did you go into law?
No, what kind of a lawyer and what kind of work did
What
you
kind of
do?
work did you do?
Well, with a little background, I think it's probably in order. I came to this country in 1948. I am very definitely the generation of the 50s. I went to school, my college, and I was absolutely determined to become an American and to achieve in the coin of real, which was at that time success, achievement, and so even though having given just a little background about the person who brought me over, who would much rather have me went to law school to become a lawyer for the ACLU, I became a lawyer for a big corporation and basically followed the career of the person who went to school and grew up in the 50s, a very American. I was determined. I should say that until the story came out and it was written, I deliberately avoided gatherings of Holocaust survivors or any of this stuff. I never participated in the Spielberg project. I basically considered that being totally separate from my life. And I'm neither proud of it nor ashamed of it. It's what I am. And basically I felt that I was going to be successful, I was achieved, and more or less I succeeded in doing that. And that's what I might add that in terms of religion, you know, as I explained, I was quite, my family and was religious. I parted way with religion actually before I came to this country. But when the book came out, while most of our audiences were mixed, we did make presentations in synagogues and other Jewish audiences. And I realized, to my regret, how much I missed, how many Jewish communities, active, vibrant, and self-confident there are, and I just missed out on that, and I'm sorry for that. But that's hopefully explains to you what kind of law I practiced and why and how I did it.
I'd like to add a footnote to what Bernie just said. We once had a reading in a Hebrew school and a German school in Silicon Valley. The German kids of the scientists baked German cookies, and the Israeli kids baked Israeli cookies. And then they sang German Christmas songs, and then some Hebrew or Yiddish songs too. Bernie stood next to him. He knew them all. And he sang them to himself, more or less. I didn't, then he was, never talked. But I could hear that he knew them all, and he sang right under his breath. It's sort of a footnote of what you just said.
I remember a huge number of these Christmas songs that I never heard or did for almost 60 years, but they're in my memory.
There's a question over there.
You guys seem to be kind of music aficionados. Do you think the association of Hitler and Wagner has decreased the appreciation of the music and rhythm?
Would you repeat the question once more also for me? I think I understood exactly what you said. Say it again.
The association, in a lot, at least in a lot of reading I've done, there's been an association with Hitler and Wagner's operas.
Yeah. Well, I come from a musician's family, and my cousin, my first cousin, she's teaching piano, taught piano to the great-granddaughter of Liszt and granddaughter of Wagner, Bayreuth. So I know the scene there a little bit. I must say, just to speak for myself, and having analyzed it a little bit, I, for a long time, could not listen to Wagner. I just could not do it. But then my cousin invited me to listen to one of the operas at Bayreuth, and I listened to incredible music. And I realized Wagner was a decadent. He was not a Nazi. So the fact that his music is so full of sensuality has nothing to do with politics and marching at all. Reconciled me to Wagner, and I now like him. But it took me, let's say, to get to this point, it took me over 30 years. It was not so much, without going into detail, it was not so much Wagner, although he was somewhat anti-Semitic. It was the people then, the Wagner Club that started afterwards, the Wagner Verein, that they are the ones that created this fascist mentality that is a little bit unfair. It may be inherent somewhere in the music, but it doesn't have to come out that way. And of course, Hitler then tied into this whole tradition. But it was the Wagner Club that brought that was the real problem. It's sort of
in your wonderful story and relationship, in the world that we live in today, where there are so many people perceived as enemies, one great Quaker philosopher once said, it is better to think of people not as enemies, but as strangers, people who we do not know, who we should get to know better. I'm wondering if you see your experience together as being extended, by other people in some of the great clashes with Islam and among, Palestinians and Jews and so forth. It seems like a wonderful development that you have built over these years, and how can it be kind of expanded in your mind?
in other words, it really goes back to encourage individualism and individual contact. I really love that story of this Israeli mother and this Palestinian mother 2 or 3 years ago contacting each other. But, I don't know whether I believe in the greening, this old idea in the 60s we had, the greening of America. You start with a kernel and it grows. What we represent can become a paradigm for general raising of consciousness. I wonder. I'm a little more skeptical or more pessimistic about it than I used to be.
My answer to that would be essentially, I think human contact, I think people getting to know each other somehow, trying to see, not in a kind of objective, or see how the other side is, but just see, my God, kids, we do this about, as Chris described, how we both have the same kind of childhood, to find this commonality in human beings, and with all of the deadliest enemies and enmities, which are almost instilled in them. If people get together, I think it almost inevitably becomes natural. But people will start to understand each other, and right now it doesn't look very hopeful, but I hold out hope for that this is going to happen. It has happened, and it can happen.
Thanks, Dave.
Question for Chris.
Yeah.
What were the conditions that existed here in the States that led to your dad's decision to move to Germany?
To understand this question? Okay. Why did he go back to Germany in 33? Basically, the depression. He was a musician at one point in the Satisfies Symphony, and then he played in these movie orchestras. In fact, he remembers he played the orchestra Marx Brothers started. He even remembers he told some of the jokes that the Marx Brothers talked up to the state when they first started. My father was not an anti-Semite. He belonged to the party, but he was not anti-Semite. He worked with Jews as musicians in the Bay Area. He went back because he lost his job. And in Germany, the relatives said, come back, we are building a new country, it's wonderful here, you should return right away. Well, he did. He packed me up with my mother and went back to Germany and joined the party less out of conviction than he got a job organizing bands. The thing what he did here, and they had these movements for the labor movement. There was rather communist or socialist in Germany. In order to bring the labor movement around, the Nazis really spent a lot of time dealing with the labor movement and so on. And they would organize train trips to the other places, to the visit countryside. My father would organize music for these people. That was his job. And then he left. Then he married. My stepmother was a bad marriage. Then he joined the army, not because he liked to fight. Once he came back from the war with he had his holster there. I said, "Show me your gun." He had a piece of wood in there. I said, "Why?" I was disappointed when I see a gun. You think I would go and shoot him? I don't want to shoot anybody, nor do I want to get shot. Besides, a gun is heavier than a piece of wood. That's the kind of Nazi he was. When he left last time, he said, look, if I don't come back and they draft you, never be in the front of the line, the enemy will shoot you. Never be in the back, the fanatics will shoot you. Always stay in the middle. That's the kind of Nazi he was, but he was part of the system. He joined, he was bilingual, and he worked up counterintelligence general staff, currency, and so on, and he was deeply implicated, indirectly, in the system. And I treated him in the book quite in terms of the very good, moral life, bad and good. He was actually a person much more complex. I didn't stress that in the book because it didn't fit my notion of the bad.
Will you join me in